Welcome to Novel Ideas. I'm Carolyn Luck, and I'm here with my co-host, Josh Brogadier.
It's great to be with you, Carol, as always.
Yeah, and we have a very special guest this evening.
That's right, we do. And Catherine Marenghi, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And we're here to talk about your memoir, Glad Farm, which is entrancing, I have to say.
Thank you.
Having finished it somewhat recently, I will say there are memorable characters throughout, and it's hard to believe this was the life that you led and still do. So, amazing.
Catherine, maybe you'd like to start off with what your world looked like when you were a little girl?
Well, it's interesting to hear you say it's hard to believe, because I think that's what spurred me to write the book. Somebody sharing stories over the dinner table with me didn't believe me when I said I grew up in a house with no indoor plumbing and a one-room shack. Said, no, you didn't. No, you didn't do that. But he encouraged me, you should write a memoir. And that's sort of how I wrote it. I hadn't even thought of writing a memoir until that moment. It was only 2013 or so. This is a story I hadn't told anybody, kept it to myself all my life. My most intimate friends didn't know just how poor I was. I let it be known that I was poor, but I didn't say just how poor. I think they assumed I had a normal house like other people, and I did not. We lived in a small one-room house that my father built himself, and he was not a carpenter. It had no proper electricity. There was no central heating in the middle of New England. That was interesting, and no indoor bathroom. We all sort of like piled on top of each other and lived in this place that was surrounded by an acre of land, a little bit isolated on the edge of town, so not very many people could even see it. We could sort of keep it to ourselves, how we lived, which was fine. But the area around us I thought was quite lovely. I thought the woods were lovely. My parents were farmers, gardeners, so there are always trees and flowers, and I felt that I was surrounded by beauty. And it took me a while before I figured out that we were really rather poor. I had to have somebody tell me that before I really understood that.
The title of your book is Glad Farm, and we don't find out much about the Glad Farm until a little bit later. This, by the way, for people who are watching, this is Milford, Massachusetts we're talking about. This is not in the middle of nowhere. This is Metro West, essentially.
This is not rural country in the South or the Midwest. This is a middle-class town, a very industrial town, ordinary by most standards. Nobody lived the way my family lived. We were quite unique in the way we lived. I was actually born in Framingham and spent the first 17 years of my life in Milford, Mass. My parents had a gladiolus farm. That's where the book gets its name. It's a flower farm, which I didn't know about until very late in life. My parents didn't really talk about very much of themselves or their past. So it took me a while to figure out that all this had happened and was very formative in my parents' experience. This was I think their dream, to have this beautiful flower farm that would grow and prosper and provide for their family at a time when gladiolus were very popular flowers. In the 40s, they were everybody's favorite. You'd give a bouquet to your girlfriend on a Saturday night. You see them in black and white movies from the 30s and 40s. There's always a beautiful spray of gladiolus in the background. And I think people don't know now just how popular they were in the 40s, and all that changed in the 50s, which is why my parents' farm failed, because the price dropped. The flower just fell out of favor for reasons that aren't quite clear.
I don't think anybody knows.
I've tried to find out. They went from being everybody's favorite bouquet to something that was a cheap filler in funeral baskets. It wasn't something that people thought of as a happy flower or a joyful flower. And it's a gorgeous, gorgeous flower.
Yeah. They also attract lots of hummingbirds.
Oh, how marvelous. I didn't know that.
When I was a kid, we used to grow everything imaginable, and that was one of my favorites.
I understand there were quite a few gladiolus farms around Massachusetts and New England. I've done book readings where somebody in the audience will say, my grandfather or my father had such a farm, and like my parents, it went away in the 50s. It just didn't work anymore for reasons I don't know.
Now, your father was actually an immigrant.
No, my grandparents were. My grandparents. My father was first generation. Milford at the time was at least half Italian, if not more. And the wave before that was Irish immigrants. And this whole new wave of immigrants now. So it was a very Italian, certainly my part of town was almost solidly Italian as I was growing up.
So tell us a little bit about your family members, because this is a big part of this, is not just the small space you were in without the plumbing that you needed and the heat that you didn't have, but also close quarters for a lot of people and a lot of personalities.
Yes, there were 7 of us at our biggest as a family. I had my parents, 2 older sisters who were 7 and 8 years older than me, an older brother, Jerry, 2 years older, a little brother, Stephen, who came along when I was about 6. There was one other baby that my mother had who was premature, who died fairly soon after birth, and really I didn't know him. But we were 5 kids in a very small space. There was something of a loft on the second, that created a little bit of a second floor. So the kids and my mother slept up there, and my dad slept downstairs in a big iron bed. My mother slept on the floor most of my childhood, didn't have even her own bed. And the rest of us shared beds, 2 in a bed, which I think a lot of kids did in that era.
Sure.
You don't see that very much anymore, but it certainly made us a very, very close group.
What size space are we talking about in terms of where we're sitting right now? People can imagine this. There are 2 chairs and a love seat.
I really don't think the footprint is that much bigger than this studio space we're sitting in. I'm guessing maybe 15 to 20 in one end, maybe by 35 to 40 long. I've been in bedrooms bigger than that.
Yeah.
But it was one space. It was, stove, sink, bed, a couple chairs on one level, table and chairs, and a big iron bed in the corner that sort of doubled as a sort of a sitting place too, and all the children's beds upstairs. We called it upstairs and downstairs. I didn't know the names of rooms when I went to school. Kids would talk about kitchens. I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what a living room was. I didn't know just a lot of things that other kids just knew. So I think going to school, I started to get the impression that maybe my family was a little bit different.
Tell us a little bit more about your sisters.
Well, they were good amount older than me, so we weren't playmates. Marcia was the oldest. She had red hair like me, and very quiet, almost nun-like. And there was a period when she wanted to be a nun. She could be seen walking the streets wearing black, and she wore these sort of black lace mantillas, and she looked very, very old for a teenage girl. Celia, dark-haired, ferocious, a tomboy, kind of a rough girl, 2 very different girls born a year apart from each other. One very quiet and reserved, the other very feisty.
And throughout your life, you're closest certainly with Jerry, your brother.
And still am.
Yeah.
And still am. I played with him a lot, played baseball. I learned to play all the boys' games, catch, and we threw green apples at each other. We threw snowballs at each other. And we've been very close all our lives. He's also a quiet, sweet man, a little reserved, a very private person. And I'm actually sharing a house with him now while I'm in the States.
Nice.
Now, Jerry was thrust into a situation way before his time of kind of having to be the man in the family.
Yes, I think when our dad passed away, we were still kids. And I think one of the worst things you can tell a young boy is you're the man of the family now. And he took that very seriously. I think he felt that it was his job to provide for the family, even though he was a boy. He took on a paper route. And as soon as he was able to work, he was working in factories for many, many years, always providing for my mother. He never left my mother's house for as long as she lived, until she went to a nursing home. He was there to provide for her and care for her. He was the caregiver of the family a role that often goes to the women in the family.
Right.
That was his role.
Is it a role that you think that he eventually embraced? Was it one that he was reluctant to, but because of circumstances that he just kind of did?
It's one he grew up with. I think he did it well. I think my mother was really lucky to have someone like him. Even when she was in a nursing home, he visited all the time and kept her company every day, read the newspaper to her in the evening. And as she had dementia, she started to not recognize people, but she always recognized him. She always kind of knew who he was. Sometimes confusing that Jerry with her husband Jerry, but that I think happens. She didn't remember me at all at a certain point, which was difficult, but my brother was there and I was very happy that he was.
Yeah. So now you're retired, and
I am.
Tell us about that.
I am retired in Mexico. I lived in Massachusetts all my life until I was 62, and had been going to a writers' conference in San Miguel de Allende in central Mexico. Very exciting writers' conference, and it was in February every year. And then I would come back to Boston during the 3 worst winters in history. And after a while, I said, why am I doing this? I decided to retire a little early, sold my house, sold my things, bought a house in Mexico. The quality of life is beautiful, the weather is beautiful, and it's a very rich cultural community as well. There are writers, there are artists, there are musicians, very international, very artistically vibrant community. And I'm very, very happy there. The weather is very, very nice. But I am back for the summer. I'm staying with my brother who has a Cape Cod home, and I'm here for the summer. But Mexico is my primary home.
So are you doing any writing while you're there?
That was certainly the plan. It's so lovely, it's sometimes distracting. I think I had this idea that I was going to go to work every day starting at 9 and continue my work schedule and just work all day writing. I think Hemingway did that. It's kind of like a job. He went to work every day at his desk from 9 to 5. But it's beautiful out there, and it's not always easy to just stay indoors all day. But I am continuing to write. I'm writing poetry quite a bit now. I'd love to write a novel, but I've only been retired a year, so I'm still kind of getting into the, trying to get a time frame down when I write and when I don't write, and still getting that, trying to get adjusted to not working all the time, which is what I did most of my life.
Well, we're looking forward to more about your writing process, and of course also a little bit more digging deeper into Glad Farm. We'll be back in just a short bit with Catherine Marenghi. Stay with us.
Fancy pants peanut butter? A big screen television? You haven't even bought a sofa yet. A motorcycle? When your father finds out, he's gonna flip his shoes with 2 buckles? What do you even need 2 buckles for? Mr. Big Shot, buying whiskey shots for everybody in the bar. From the looks of it, I'd say nobody even remembers. Feed the pig.
Planning the right amount of food is hard. The Guestimator makes it easy. Just tell it who's coming and what's for dinner. Then it tells you how much to make. And yes, it even plans for leftovers. Try it at SaveTheFood.com.
To Maddie, congrats on paying off all those student loans.
Finally, right?
How'd you manage that anyway?
I started tracking my spending, changed a couple of habits.
Wow, I'm kind of living paycheck to paycheck right now. I don't even know how I'm doing it.
Well, have you tried saving a little?
I want to, but where's that money gonna come from? Bill collectors, they're the worst. Am I right?
When it comes to financial stability, don't get left behind.
Not home.
Get tools and tips for saving at feedthepig.org.
And I can't
We are neighbors and best friends.
I love my sister.
My heart doesn't see race. Love is love.
Our family is no less than any other family.
You made this vacation happen, cleverly merging promotions,
double points with every purchase,
and cross-referencing travel sites. Aloha! If you can ace your vacation, you can do it for retirement. Get on track with tips at aceyourretirement.org.
I've always wanted to go to college. That helps you evolve as a person. I just feel like that's my destiny. My name is Queen, and I am your dividend.
Welcome back to Novel Ideas. We're here with wonderful author Catherine Marenghi, and we're going to be talking about her book, Glad Farm, for the second half, as well as a little more background on where she's from and all of the vulnerabilities that come along with opening your heart and telling your story. So would you like to pick up a little bit more about what you think is important in telling this story?
Well, it was such an interesting experience to write this story, a story that I kept to myself for so many years, and didn't think anybody would relate to, because it was so different from how other people live. And after writing it, it's been interesting that people have told me that they see themselves in it in some way. Even though their experience might be not exactly the same, they might have understood the experience of being ashamed of one's house because their mother was alcoholic. Different situation, but they understood the feeling. They understood the feeling of being an outsider, maybe because they were gay or they were an outsider for some other reason. People, for some reason, were seeing their own stories, which completely shocked me because I didn't know what the reaction would be. I was just pouring out every detail I could remember and think of, and really wondered what people were going to think of that. Would they have just sort of a voyeuristic interest, just a morbid curiosity in how other people live? And I was shocked that people told me they saw themselves. People have been coming, I wrote it while I was still working full time, and people were coming into my office and telling me their life stories. Says, oh, I just read this chapter of yours and I've got to tell you, my house burned down when I was a little girl. And I'm thinking, I didn't understand what the connection was, but they were seeing something in the emotion of the experience that they related to. And I wanted you have a lot of visual detail, sensory detail in the book, because I think that's how people connect to you. And they were seeing their own story reflected back at them, which was a total surprise and delight to me that I wish I had told it sooner. I wish I knew that I had all these connections with people that I didn't know I had.
So taking it one step back, so how did you finally decide that you could unload all of this information, all of this pain that you'd had over the years, and put it on a page? When did that happen, and take us through that moment?
Well, after my son graduated from college, and I had, been focused like a laser for so many years on providing for my family, making sure I was saving for college, doing all the good things a responsible parent does. And once he had graduated from college, I felt, now I can do all of the creative writing that I'd been deferring for years. And I went to a writer's retreat in Vermont, and with the idea that I was going to be writing poetry. And just in the process of sharing stories around a dinner table with total strangers, I felt comfortable sharing a little bit of detail about my life. And the gentleman who ran the retreats just didn't believe me. He just didn't believe that I'm educated, I've traveled, and he just didn't believe that I would come from such an impoverished background. And after sharing more stories and more, he said, you should write a memoir, something that never even occurred to me. But the suggestion came at a time when my brother had just sold the family house. We need to clean it out. And I had the job of going through my mother's old cedar chest. People used to have these grand boxes that had household items, but in my mother's case, she put everything of importance into this box. And it sort of was like geological layers. The farther down you dug, the older the things were. But she kept everything. She had dozens of receipts from the milkman in the 1940s. She had war bonds. She had photographs. And the thing that was a total surprise to me was that she ran a business. She was an entrepreneur. A woman I remembered as a barefoot farmer in a ragged dress who never spoke of her background, had a college degree. I found her yearbook. She had a business training. She was the accountant for this enterprise that she started with my father. They did what any entrepreneur does. They see a business opportunity, a very popular flower. The gladiolus was extremely popular. They started this farm. My mother kept track of inventory. She did financial projections. Everything I did as an entrepreneur later in life, she did on paper, on scraps of envelopes. She had invoices. She had subscriptions to trade magazines. Everything I did as a business, she did. She treated it very seriously, as in addition to doing the hard physical labor of working on a farm. Both my parents did that. My father did that in addition to working in a factory job. They worked very, very hard on making this come true, and it failed. And it failed before I was born. And I was born in 1954. So in the early 50s, something happened in the gladiolus market. The prices fell through the floor. They were no longer popular. Nobody liked them as a bouquet anymore. They just became a cheap filler flower. And the farm failed. The prices dropped, and it was something that was very difficult for them to experience, and probably why they never talked about it.
Did you see your mother in a different light then, once this all?
Absolutely, absolutely. And unfortunately, she had already passed away at that point. I wish I had known. I wish I had known. I also found books. She loved poetry. I didn't know that. I would have loved to know that. She even wrote a few poems. She had a whole life that, as someone who grew up in the Depression, who went through World War II, I think it's fairly typical of that generation. These were very stoic, strong people who didn't focus on their problems, just forged ahead. Something terrible happens, just forget about it, go back to work, get on with your life. And they didn't whine and complain about their problems. They didn't think that was a thing to do. And my mother was extremely quiet anyway, as a person. She was very quiet, never spoke. Unless you asked her a very direct question, you would not get an answer. So I learned a great deal, and that came at the time when somebody made the suggestion to me, you should write this. And that idea sort of took hold, and I wrote nights, I wrote weekends. I'd get up in the middle of the night and remember something that I had to write down. And wrote a first draft very quickly, in about 6 months. And then spent 2 years verifying, checking, rewriting, calling people, saying, did I get this straight?
This generation also seemed to have had a lot more secrets. And
Yes.
particularly, family members. There were a lot of family members on my mother's side that, this one wasn't speaking to that one over this reason or that reason.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
and my mother was always the one in the middle that talked to everybody, and they would try to get her to take sides.
Oh my.
And
Oh
I
my.
never ever knew what half the secrets were or why this one. I'd say, Mommy, why are they fighting with each other?
Probably something very trivial. I used to think that was something Italian because I grew up in an Italian neighborhood, and there's always somebody holding a grudge against someone else, would not speak. On my father's side of the family, he had 7 siblings. Most of them didn't talk to each other. He had a brother who looked like he could have been a twin to him. They didn't speak. And again, trying to unravel what went on in their lives when I'm very late in my life, in my late 50s. I'm just starting to dig into this. Why didn't they talk about things? What was it that kept them apart? And I found evidence of some very dark and difficult things that happened to them that were a surprise to me. And there may be many more things I don't know that made life very hard for them. I think my father was a very troubled, very broken, very dispirited person when I knew him as a child. And there were reasons for it that I didn't know until fairly recently.
Sure. Would you like to read a passage for us?
I'd love to. There's
writing?
a short piece about my mother.
Sure.
And this was when I was a little girl, and we lived in the old house. Walking up the dirt path, I squinted in the sun and saw Ma out in the vegetable gardens, bent over from the waist, weeding the tomatoes. Her pale cotton dress was bleached and nearly white from the sun. She was born and raised on a farm, and she had a special talent for making things grow. It was in her blood. My father did too. Between the two of them, the yard was ablaze in flowers. Roses, lupins, daylilies, daffodils, jonquils, tulips, and my favorite, the delicate bearded irises. Not to mention all the blossoming fruit trees, plum, peach, apple, cherry, quince, and pear. Even in the winter, our drafty windows bloomed with red geraniums, surrounded by shallow wooden boxes of tomato seedlings with their tiny yellow blossoms, ready to plant in the spring. I was in the house swirling a packet of purple Kool-Aid in a water-filled jelly jar when Ma burst in through the ragged screen door, her bounty wrapped in her kitchen apron. Huge tomatoes with deep brown scars, the last of the Swiss chard, wax beans, crooked carrots, a few parched ears of corn, and zucchini squash that were left to grow to gargantuan proportions. In summer, we ate. I loved my mother's summer perfume, a heady aroma of pungent tomato plants, earth, and sweat. Her thick body was hardened from years of wielding shovels, axes, and hoes, and her large, sagging breasts hung low in her shirtwaist dress. I loved her sensual girth and the secure feeling of perching on her ample lap, as solid as sitting on oak. How proud I felt the first time I was big enough to reach all the way around my mother's wide waist so my fingertips touched together behind her back. Ma wiped the sweat from her face with her crumpled apron and set to work making tomato and mayonnaise sandwiches on coarse Italian bread. I loved to watch her hands as she worked, strong, thick, and leathery, more like a man's than a woman's hands, with dark earth permanently etched under her fingernails no matter how hard she scrubbed them. She was worn and weathered all over, like the old apple tree, bearing all the marks of too many harvests, too many children, too much caring and tending for others, but never for herself, always saving the best for her husband and children, while sopping her bread with gravy from the frying pan for her supper.
Talk about taking us there. Wow.
Yes. Oh, that's amazing. She's just right here in this room with us.
Yeah.
And we can just see her. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
I love your prose. It is, I mean, talk about descriptive and amazing.
Very honest.
Yeah.
And very direct.
Yeah.
It's, you know, I look at this picture on the cover, as you can see this, and this picture you speak about just in this way, that this one line you have in here, it was black and white, but it has always blazed with color in my memory. And that is, it is a colorful book told in black and white. Beautifully done.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being our guest.
I so appreciate your asking me. Thank you.
Yes, it's been such a delight. You really fall in the category of one of the authors that writes for a better world. And I feel like as people relate to this, they come to understand that not everybody makes their own beds, and yet they have to forge through and keep going, and it's beautiful. And so thank you again.
Thank you.
We're here at Novel Ideas talking with Catherine, and we're just absolutely thrilled. Her book is available on Amazon and on her website.
Or listen to it on Audible.
Yes.
On Audible, it's on Audible, Kindle, and paperback.
Wonderful. You narrate yourself?
Yes, I do.
So much the better.
Yeah, and we'd like to thank Shivarsh, our director, and the folks here at Access Framingham for making this show possible. And thank you, our viewers. We'll see you next time for Novel Ideas and more very interesting stories.
Good night.
Good night.